Imagine you built something so dominant, so deeply woven into the fabric of modern life, that billions of people couldn't imagine the world without it. Imagine that thing, that one product, was your entire identity for 30 years. Your logo, your legacy, your reason for existing in the minds of every human being on the planet. Now imagine quietly, methodically, without a single dramatic press conference or a tearful farewell, you started walking away from it. Not because it failed, not because it collapsed, but because you saw something coming on the horizon that was bigger, more powerful, and more valuable than anything you'd ever built before. And you had the cold, calculated discipline to let go of your greatest achievement in order to reach for it. That is exactly what Microsoft has been doing. And the truly staggering part? Most people have absolutely no idea it's happening. Right now, as you're watching this, Microsoft is one of the most valuable companies in the history of human civilization. Its market capitalization has crossed $3 trillion. Its stock has done something extraordinary that almost no large company ever manages. It didn't just recover, it didn't just grow, it completely reinvented its trajectory after more than a decade of being written off as a bloated relic of the PC era. Analysts who spent years calling Microsoft irrelevant, boring, and past its prime are now tripping over themselves to upgrade their price targets. Investors who abandoned the company during its lost decade are desperately trying to buy back in. And the reason for all of this isn't some flashy new gadget. It isn't a charismatic founder returning from exile. It isn't a viral product that swept the world overnight. The reason is a quiet, disciplined, almost invisible pivot away from the one thing that made Microsoft, Microsoft.Windows. To understand why this matters, why it's one of the most consequential corporate transformations in modern business history, you need to understand just how enormous Windows actually was, not just as a product, but as an idea, as a cultural force, as something that fundamentally shaped how the entire human species interacted with technology for 3 decades straight. When IBM needed an operating system for its new personal computer back in 1981, a young Bill Gates struck a deal that would change everything. Microsoft didn't even write the software they sold IBM. They bought a system called QEDOS for $50,000, licensed it to IBM, and retained the rights to sell it to other manufacturers. It was one of the most strategically brilliant moves in the history of business, and almost no one recognized it at the time. From that moment, Microsoft began its climb toward total dominance. By the time Windows 95 launched, the company had achieved something almost unprecedented in the technology industry. It hadn't just won the market, it had become the market. The startup sound of Windows 95, played on televisions across America. The Rolling Stones licensed a song to Microsoft for an advertisement. People lined up outside stores at midnight to buy a computer operating system the way they would line up for concert tickets today. Think about how surreal that is. People were excited about an operating system, not a phone, not a gaming console, a piece of software that told a computer how to function. Microsoft had turned something deeply technical and utilitarian into a cultural event. And over the next 2 decades, that dominance only deepened. By the mid-2000s, Windows was running on well over 90% of all personal computers on Earth. Entire governments, entire school systems, entire industries had built their infrastructure around it. The software that ran hospitals, managed air traffic control, processed banking transactions, stored government records, all of it ran on Windows. Multiple countries launched formal antitrust investigations against Microsoft, not because the company had done something obviously criminal, but simply because Windows was so dominant that its existence alone was considered a threat to competition. That is the level of power we're talking about, not just a successful product, a force of nature. And then something shifted. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment where Windows fell from grace. What happened was more subtle and more dangerous. The world changed around Microsoft, and for a critical stretch of time, Microsoft didn't change with it. The iPhone launched in 2007, and within a few years, it became clear that the future of computing wasn't sitting at a desk with a tower PC running Windows. It was in your pocket. It was a touchscreen. It was apps downloaded from a store, not software installed from a disk. Apple wasn't just selling a phone. It was rewriting the rules of what a computing device could be, and Microsoft missed it almost entirely. Then Google built Android and made it available to every hardware manufacturer on Earth, creating a parallel mobile ecosystem that would eventually put a powerful computer in the hands of billions of people who had never owned a Windows PC and never would. The developing world didn't go through the PC era the way the West did. They leapfrogged straight to smartphones, straight to mobile internet, straight to a computing experience that Windows was never designed to provide. Meanwhile, Facebook was building a social layer on top of the internet that made people spend more of their digital lives inside a browser or an app than on the desktop. Amazon was quietly building the infrastructure that would eventually become the backbone of the entire internet economy. Cloud computing services that let companies run software without buying a single server. Google was building Search, Gmail, Google Docs, YouTube, and Maps. Services so useful that people were spending their entire computing lives inside Google. Products, with the operating system underneath, becoming increasingly invisible and irrelevant. Microsoft saw all of this happening. They tried to respond. They launched Windows Phone, and it never caught on. They built tablets, and they struggled to find an audience. They tried to make Windows touch-friendly with Windows 8, and it was one of the biggest interface disasters in the company's history. They tried to force a tablet experience onto desktop users and alienated both audiences simultaneously. The stock price barely moved for more than a decade. Analysts wrote obituaries. Tech journalists called Microsoft the new IBM. Once dominant, now a cautionary tale about companies that fail to adapt. Inside the company, there was a cultural problem as deep as any strategic one. Microsoft had become a place where internal politics mattered more than innovation. Different teams competed against each other rather than collaborating. The performance review system incentivized employees to undermine colleagues because everyone was graded on a curve. Your success required someone else's failure. The company that had once been the most feared competitor in Silicon Valley had turned its most destructive competitive instincts inward. By 2013, the situation had become serious enough that the board knew something radical had to change. Steve Ballmer, who had run Microsoft for more than a decade and delivered genuine revenue growth but had catastrophically missed every major technology shift of the era, announced he would step down. The board began a search for a new chief executive, and the person they chose surprised almost everyone. Satya Nadella was not a Silicon Valley celebrity. He was not a flamboyant visionary who gave TED Talks and appeared on magazine covers. He was a deeply technical, quietly thoughtful engineer who had spent his entire career at Microsoft, most of it running the Azure cloud division, which at the time was a relatively small and unglamorous part of the company's business. He didn't come in with a dramatic manifesto. He didn't fire half the executive team and restructure everything overnight. He came in with a book, a cultural philosophy captured in the concept of growth mindset, borrowed from psychologist Carol Dweck, and a strategic conviction so counterintuitive that many people inside Microsoft genuinely couldn't process it at first. Nadella's thesis was simple and devastating in its clarity. Microsoft had to stop defining itself by Windows, not because Windows was dead or dying, but because tying the company's identity and growth strategy to a single legacy product was a trap. The world was moving to cloud computing. The world was moving to mobile. The world was becoming multi-platform. And Microsoft's obsession with Windows as the center of all things was preventing it from building the kind of products and services that would matter in the next era of technology. He said it plainly, in public, in ways that made longtime Microsoft veterans genuinely uncomfortable. The future was cloud. The future was services. The future was making Microsoft's products work beautifully on iPhones and Android devices and Macs, even if that meant competing with Windows on some level. The goal was no longer to be the operating system. The goal was to be the cloud and productivity layer that sat on top of every operating system. To appreciate how radical this was, you have to understand the culture Nadella was walking into. At Microsoft in 2014, suggesting that the company should make its products work great on Apple devices was not a strategic recommendation. It was borderline heresy. Windows was the reason Microsoft existed. It was the product around which every other product was organized. Office was there to run on Windows. Internet Explorer was there to run on Windows. Even the Xbox, which had nothing technically to do with Windows, was positioned as part of the Windows ecosystem. Every career, every team, every product decision was oriented around Windows at the center. Nadella dismantled that assumption methodically. He didn't announce it dramatically. He just started making decisions that reflected a different set of priorities. Microsoft Office came to the iPhone and iPad with genuine, thoughtful design, not a crippled port. Azure started getting massive investment and began competing seriously with Amazon Web Services. The company opened up to open source software in ways that would have been unthinkable under previous leadership. Microsoft, the company that had once called Linux a cancer, eventually became one of the largest contributors to the Linux kernel in the world. They acquired GitHub, the platform where the overwhelming majority of the world's software is written, for $7.5 billion. GitHub ran on Linux. Its users were overwhelmingly Mac and Linux developers. The acquisition had essentially nothing to do with Windows. Each of these moves, taken individually, looked like a pragmatic business decision. Taken together, they told a story about a company fundamentally reorienting itself around a new center of gravity. And then the numbers started arriving. Azure, Microsoft's cloud computing platform, began growing at rates that made even optimistic projections look conservative. Quarter after quarter, year after year, Azure posted growth numbers that rivaled the fastest growing companies in Silicon Valley. Except Azure wasn't a startup, it was a division of a company that had been founded in 1975. Microsoft 365, the subscription version of Office that replaced the old model of selling a boxed license once every few years, began generating tens of billions of dollars in predictable recurring annual revenue. GitHub Copilot, an AI tool that helps software developers write code, became one of the fastest adopted developer tools in history. Teams, Microsoft's workplace collaboration platform, went from virtually unknown to having hundreds of millions of active users, accelerated enormously by the pandemic, forcing the entire global economy to work remotely overnight. And then came the investment that changed everything. In 2019, Microsoft made an initial investment in OpenAI, the artificial intelligence research company that would eventually create ChatGPT. Over subsequent years, that investment grew to a reported $13 billion across multiple rounds. A bet so large and so concentrated on a single company that it wasn't a hedge or an experiment. It was a declaration of conviction. Microsoft was saying, loudly and in dollar terms, that it believed artificial intelligence would remake every piece of software ever written, and that it intended to be the company that sat at the center of that transformation. The integration that followed was breathtaking in its scope and speed. Copilot, Microsoft's AI assistant powered by OpenAI's models and running on Azure's infrastructure, was embedded into everything. It came to Microsoft 365 so that anyone writing a Word document or building an Excel spreadsheet could have an AI assistant helping them in real time. It came to GitHub so that developers writing code could have an AI that understood their entire code base and suggested completions, caught bugs, and explained complex functions. It came to Azure, giving enterprise customers powerful AI capabilities built directly into the cloud infrastructure they were already paying for. It came to Bing, turning a search engine that had always lived in Google's shadow into something genuinely different and interesting. And yes, it came to Windows. There is now a physical Copilot. Key on new Windows keyboards, a dedicated button whose entire purpose is to summon an AI assistant. But here's the crucial thing to understand about that Windows Copilot key, because it perfectly illustrates the strategic genius of what Microsoft has been doing. That button isn't really a Windows feature. When you press it and Copilot opens, you're not running a local program that lives on your computer. You are connecting to Azure. You are connecting to OpenAI's models. You are pulling intelligence from a network of cloud servers that Microsoft owns and operates. The button is on a Windows device, but the value, the actual intelligence, the thing that makes Copilot useful, lives in the cloud. Microsoft is using Windows as a delivery mechanism. It's using a product that hundreds of millions of people already have, already trust, already open every morning without thinking about it, as a doorway into a cloud subscription ecosystem. Every time someone uses Copilot through Windows, they are not just using Windows, they are becoming a customer of Azure, a consumer of OpenAI models, a subscriber to an AI-powered service that bills monthly and grows more valuable as it learns more about how they work. This is genuinely one of the most elegant Trojan horse strategies in the history of business. And look at the revenue data, because it tells the story more clearly than anything else. In Microsoft's most recent fiscal year, the Intelligent Cloud division, the one that houses Azure and the company's enterprise cloud services, generated over $110 billion in revenue. The Personal Computing division, which is where Windows lives alongside Xbox and the Surface hardware line, generated around $60 billion. That means Windows and everything bundled with it now represents less than a third of what Microsoft earns. And the gap isn't staying the same, it's widening every quarter. Azure is growing at double-digit rates. Windows revenue is growing slowly, if at all. This is the financial reality that investors have priced into that $3 trillion valuation. The market isn't excited about Microsoft because of Windows. It hasn't been excited about Microsoft because of Windows in years. It's excited because Azure is a cash machine. Because Microsoft 365 subscriptions keep compounding. Because GitHub Copilot is being adopted by enterprises at staggering rates. Because the OpenAI partnership positions Microsoft at the center of every serious conversation about the future of artificial intelligence. Think about what the subscription model change actually means for Microsoft's business in the most fundamental terms. Under the old model, you bought a license for Windows. Maybe you paid once every 5 years when a new version came out. Microsoft got one payment from you, then essentially nothing until you needed to upgrade again. Under the new model, you pay every single month for Microsoft 365. You pay every month for Azure services if you're running a business. You pay every month for GitHub Copilot if you're a developer. Microsoft knows with extraordinary precision exactly how much money you will spend with them over the next year, the next 5 years, the next decade. That predictability is worth an enormous amount. It's why subscription businesses command such high valuations. And it's why Microsoft's investors have rewarded this transformation so richly. And the elegant, almost cruel beauty of this transition is that it doesn't require Windows to succeed. A Microsoft 365 subscription works perfectly on a Mac. It works on an iPad. It works on a Chromebook. It works on any device with a browser. Azure doesn't care what operating system your employees are using at home. GitHub doesn't care that most of its users are on Macs or Linux machines. Microsoft has deliberately, consciously built its new revenue base to be independent of Windows, which means the company now profits whether you use Windows or not. That represents a philosophical transformation that goes deeper than any product decision. It required Microsoft to genuinely accept something that would have been psychologically impossible for the old. Microsoft to accept that the company's future was not contingent on controlling the operating system, that it could thrive in a world where Apple controlled mobile, Google controlled Android, and various Linux distributions powered most of the world's servers, as long as Microsoft services and AI tools were embedded in all of those worlds. The old Microsoft fought wars to own the platform. The new Microsoft decided to be indispensable to every platform, and that decision has turned out to be worth trillions of dollars. The enterprise cloud story deserves particular attention because it represents one of the most significant shifts in how large organizations actually run their operations. Businesses used to have server rooms, physical machines humming in a basement or a dedicated data center maintained by an IT team, upgraded every few years at enormous expense. Those servers ran Windows Server. The computers at every desk ran Windows. The email ran on Microsoft Exchange, which ran on Windows Server. Everything was Windows, all the way down. That world still exists, but it's being rapidly replaced by something different. Azure Virtual Desktop lets companies run Windows itself as a cloud service, rather than installing Windows on every machine. Employees log into a Windows session that lives entirely on Microsoft servers and is streamed to whatever device they happen to be sitting in front of. The physical computer becomes almost irrelevant. It's just a screen that shows you a Windows environment that lives somewhere in a Microsoft data center. This means Microsoft is literally selling Windows as a subscription cloud service, and in doing so, has made the physical installation of the operating system increasingly beside the point. The gaming division tells a parallel story that's easy to overlook, but is genuinely important. Xbox Game Pass has transformed how Microsoft thinks about the video game business. Rather than selling individual games for $60 or $70 each, a model that depends entirely on people choosing to buy a specific title, Game Pass sells access to a library of hundreds of games for a monthly fee. It's the Netflix model applied to gaming, and like Netflix, it doesn't care what device you're watching on. Xbox Cloud Gaming lets subscribers stream games directly to iPhones and Android phones and smart TVs. The acquisition of Activision Blizzard, which closed after an enormous regulatory battle, added franchises Call of Duty, World of Warcraft, Overwatch, Diablo, that reach hundreds of millions of players across PlayStation, mobile, and PC simultaneously. None of this is a Windows strategy. All of it is a content and subscription strategy. The developer ecosystem piece of this is perhaps the most quietly powerful of all. GitHub is where the software of the world gets built. Tens of millions of developers use it every day. It stores the code that runs the apps on your phone, the websites you visit, the enterprise software that keeps corporations functioning. When Microsoft acquired GitHub in 2018, a significant number of developers were genuinely worried. This was the company that had spent years fighting open source software, and now it owned the most important open source platform on the planet. But Nadella understood exactly what he was buying and exactly how not to destroy it. GitHub continued operating with its culture intact. The open source community slowly, grudgingly began to trust that Microsoft wasn't going to ruin the thing they'd built. And then GitHub Copilot arrived and made the entire acquisition look like one of the smartest deals in technology history. GitHub Copilot is an AI coding assistant that has been adopted by enterprises faster than almost any developer tool in history. It doesn't just suggest code completions. It understands context, explains unfamiliar code, catches potential bugs, helps developers work in programming languages they're not fully fluent in. It is genuinely transformative for software development. And crucially, it runs on Azure and is billed as a subscription. The developers using it are overwhelmingly on Macs and Linux machines. The tool has nothing to do with Windows. It has everything to do with Microsoft's cloud and AI infrastructure. Now look at the big picture of what Nadella has actually built over the past decade. Because when you step back and see the full architecture, it's extraordinary. He has constructed a company that captures value at every layer of the modern technology stack. You need cloud computing. Infrastructure. Azure. You need productivity tools. Microsoft 365. You need to build software. GitHub and GitHub Copilot. You need AI capabilities. Azure AI services, and the OpenAI partnership. You need enterprise communication and collaboration, Teams. You want gaming entertainment? Xbox Game Pass and the Activision library. Microsoft has a serious, competitive, often market-leading position in every single one of these categories, and they are all connected by the common thread of Azure as the underlying infrastructure and AI as the differentiating intelligence layer. Windows fits into this architecture, but it fits as a surface, a familiar, trusted interface through which hundreds of millions of people access all of these other things. It's not the engine anymore, it's the dashboard. And Microsoft has been very careful not to break the dashboard, because people are comfortable with it and comfort matters. But they've also been completely clear-eyed about the fact that the engine is elsewhere. Consider the Windows 11 transition as a case study in Microsoft's changed priorities. When Windows 11 launched in 2021, Microsoft imposed hardware requirements, most notably the TPM 2.0 security chip requirement that left hundreds of millions of older PCs unable to officially upgrade. The backlash was immediate and loud. Tech commentators were furious. Users felt abandoned. The PC industry was confused. And Microsoft's response was essentially a shrug. In the old Microsoft, an upgrade cycle problem of that magnitude would have triggered emergency meetings and potentially policy reversals. Windows was the product that generated the revenue that paid for everything else, and if users weren't upgrading, that was a genuine crisis requiring urgent response. In the new Microsoft, whether you're on Windows 10 or Windows 11 doesn't materially change whether you're subscribed to Microsoft 365. Whether your company's workloads are running on Azure, whether your developers are using GitHub Copilot. The version of Windows you're running has become, in a very real financial sense, beside the point for Microsoft's most important revenue streams. The end of support for Windows 10 in October 2025 is a fascinating data point here. Microsoft communicated it, offered extended security update programs for enterprises willing to pay, encouraged hardware makers to build new AI-capable PCs running Windows 11. But there was no panic. No aggressive upgrade campaign, no sense of existential urgency. Because Microsoft has built a business model that is, for the first time in its history, genuinely and substantially independent of which version of Windows its users are running. There's a deeper technological shift at play here that Microsoft understands more clearly than almost anyone, and it's worth spending a moment on because it points toward where all of this is heading. The entire history of personal computing has been organized around operating systems as the central unit of value. You bought a computer that ran Windows, and that was the foundation on which everything else was built. Applications ran on Windows. Files were stored on Windows. Your digital life was organized around Windows. Artificial intelligence changes that architecture in a potentially profound way. If you can talk to your computer in natural language and have it understand what you want, draft the document, build the spreadsheet, find the file, schedule the meeting, summarize the email thread. If the intelligence itself becomes the interface, then the operating system underneath becomes increasingly invisible. What matters is not which OS you're running, it's which AI you're talking to. And Microsoft has spent over $13 billion ensuring that the answer for hundreds of millions of enterprise users is Copilot, running on Azure, powered by OpenAI. This is the long game that Nadella has been playing all along, and it's more ambitious than most people have given him credit for. It's not just about shifting revenue from Windows licenses to cloud subscriptions. It's about positioning Microsoft to be the company that sits between human beings and the intelligence layer of their digital lives, the company whose AI they talk to, whose cloud stores their data, whose tools they use to do their work, whose infrastructure runs the software that runs their world. Windows was a powerful position to be in. Being the AI layer is potentially an even more powerful position, and it's one that isn't constrained by the fact that most of the world's new devices aren't Windows PCs. What makes this transformation genuinely remarkable? What separates it from the many corporate reinvention stories that get told and forgotten is the way it was executed. There were no dramatic announcements, no press conferences where an executive stood on a stage and said, "The era of Windows is ending." No tearful farewells to a beloved product. Microsoft never insulted Windows. It never told its existing users that they were wrong to care about it. It simply, quietly, over a period of years, stopped building its future around it. The revenue mix changed gradually. The executive presentations shifted their emphasis gradually. The product investments tilted toward cloud and AI gradually. The cultural identity of the company moved away from Windows gradually. And by the time most people noticed what had happened, it was already done. Azure was already bigger than Windows. Microsoft 365 was already generating more lifetime customer value than any Windows license ever had. GitHub and the developer ecosystem were already central to the company's identity in ways that had nothing to do with Windows. The transformation was complete before it was announced. That is an extraordinary thing to pull off. Most companies that need to reinvent themselves either move too slowly, remaining loyal to a legacy product until it's genuinely too late, or move too quickly, destroying what made them valuable in the pursuit of what might make them valuable in the future. Microsoft did neither. It maintained Windows, kept it functional and relevant and trusted, while simultaneously building an entirely new center of gravity that it migrated toward over the course of a decade. The patience required for that is genuinely rare. The company that investors wrote off as a slow dinosaur in 2010 is now worth more than any company on Earth has ever been worth. The company whose stock went essentially nowhere for 12 years has tripled and quadrupled and quintupled since Nadella took over. The company that tech journalists described as irrelevant and out of touch is now considered, by serious observers of the industry, to be perhaps the single best positioned technology company for the next 2 decades. Microsoft has cloud infrastructure that rivals Amazon. It has AI capabilities that lead the industry through the OpenAI partnership. It has enterprise relationships built over decades that give it a sales channel into virtually every large organization on Earth. It has developer tools at the heart of how software gets built globally. It has productivity software used by hundreds of millions of workers every day. It has a gaming business moving aggressively toward the subscription model that will define entertainment for the next generation. And yes, it still has Windows, running on over 1 billion active devices. Still important, still trusted, still the starting point for hundreds of millions of people's digital days. But Windows is no longer the answer to the question of what Microsoft is. It's a part of the answer. A significant, durable, genuinely important part. But just a part. The full answer today is Azure, Copilot, artificial intelligence, the cloud, GitHub, Microsoft 365, and a platform built to run everywhere, on everything, for everyone. The next time you click the Start button on your Windows machine, take a second to think about what you're actually looking at. You're looking at the product that made Microsoft one of the most powerful companies in human history. You're looking at something that genuinely shaped the modern world. 3 decades of civilization ran on that thing. Schools, hospitals, governments, businesses, families, the entire infrastructure of the digital age. But the company that built it, that company has already moved on. It moved on quietly, deliberately, brilliantly, without breaking what it left behind. And in doing so, it has built something that may turn out to be even more enduring, even more valuable, and even more woven into the fabric of human life than Windows ever was: the Empire. Microsoft is building now doesn't live in a blue Start button. It lives in data centers on every continent. It lives in AI models that can reason and write and code. It lives in the cloud infrastructure that increasingly underlies every serious application being built anywhere in the world. It lives in the subscription revenue that compounds quarterly with the reliability of gravity. Microsoft walked away from Windows. They did it in silence, with strategy, with patience, and with a clarity of vision that almost no company in history has managed to execute at this scale. And the result is one of the most successful corporate reinventions ever attempted. A company that shed its old identity not through crisis or collapse, but through choice, discipline, and the rare courage to let go of what made it great in order to build what will make it greater. The next era of Microsoft doesn't look like Windows. It looks like the future, and somehow quietly they already got there.